The security officer looked at me like I didn't belong in first class, even though I held the boarding pass in my trembling hands. "Ma'am, are you sure this is your seat?" she asked, her tone dripping with doubt as her eyes swept over my appearance, lingering on my natural hair and the slight southern drawl that colored my words like honey over warm biscuits. "Which country are you listening from? Tell us in the comments below." My name is Maya Johnson, and for 34 years I've called Atlanta, Georgia my home. Not just any home, but the kind of home where sweet tea flows like water, where Sunday dinners stretch into the evening hours, and where the sound of church bells mingles with the distant hum of traffic on I-85. Growing up in the heart of the South, I learned early that my voice carried stories of my grandmother Essie Mae who picked cotton with bleeding fingers but still found time to teach me how to read, my mother Patricia who became the first person in our family to graduate college despite teachers who told her she wasn't college material, and my own journey through business school where I was often the only black face in lecture halls filled with future executives. I never tried to hide my accent. Why should I? It's the melody of Sunday dinners where 3 generations gathered around my grandmother's oak table, the rhythm of church choirs where voices lifted in harmonies that made the rafters shake, and the cadence of late-night conversations on front porches where wisdom was passed down through stories and sweet iced tea. It's the sound of resilience, of generations who found beauty in their speech even when the world told them it wasn't proper enough, educated enough, or refined enough for polite society. My accent carries the weight of history, not just my personal history but the collective memory of a people who survived the Middle Passage, slavery, Jim Crow, and every attempt to strip away their humanity. When I speak, I hear echoes of field hollers that became blues, of spirituals that sustained souls through unimaginable hardship, of oral traditions that preserved African culture when written records were forbidden. My grandmother used to tell me, "Baby girl, your voice is your power. Don't let anybody convince you to make it smaller." By 2019, I had spent 8 years building my travel consulting business from the ground up, starting with nothing more than a dream, a laptop, and an unshakable belief that travel should be about more than Instagram photos and tourist traps. What started as helping friends plan their honeymoons had grown into something I never imagined. A company called Roots and Routes Travel that specialized in creating authentic cultural experiences for travelers seeking connection, understanding, and transformation rather than just relaxation. We weren't the biggest firm in Atlanta, but we were making a difference. Our clients didn't just visit Paris. They learned to make pain au chocolate with a grandmother in Montmartre who remembered when her neighborhood was filled with artists instead of tourists. They didn't just see the pyramids in Egypt. They sat with archaeologists over mint tea and heard stories about discoveries that never made the news. They didn't just tour plantations in Louisiana. They met with historians and descendants who told the complete story, not the sanitized version designed to make white visitors comfortable. I loved my work because it reminded me daily that every accent tells a story, every culture has value, and every journey, whether across the world or across the street from where you grew up, has the power to change us in ways we never expected. When clients called our office and heard my southern drawl, some were surprised. They expected a travel consultant to sound international, whatever that meant. But the clients who stayed, who trusted us with their most important trips, often told me later that it was exactly my authenticity that made them feel confident we could help them find authentic experiences abroad. Our success hadn't come easily. In the early days, I faced skepticism from potential clients who couldn't reconcile my accent with their assumptions about expertise. I remember one particularly painful phone call with a potential corporate client who said, "We were looking for someone with more global sophistication." I knew what he meant. He wanted someone who sounded like she belonged in the international business world, someone whose voice wouldn't remind him that he was working with a black woman from the South. But for every client who questioned my credibility, there were 2 more who appreciated our authentic approach. We built our reputation not by hiding who we were, but by being exactly who we were: Southern, proud, knowledgeable, and committed to showing people that the world is far more beautiful and complex than any stereotype or assumption. That Tuesday morning in March, I was heading to Seattle to meet with a potential client that could change everything for my small business. TechForward, a multinational technology company with offices in 12 countries. They were interested in creating cultural immersion programs for their international employees, opportunities for their teams to understand not just how to work in different countries, but how to connect with local communities, understand historical contexts, and build relationships that went beyond business transactions. The contract would be the largest in our company's history. More importantly, it represented validation that our approach, treating cultural exchange as a form of education rather than entertainment, was exactly what forward-thinking companies needed in an increasingly globalized world. I had spent 3 weeks preparing for this meeting, researching TechForward's corporate culture, studying their existing diversity and inclusion initiatives, and crafting a presentation that would demonstrate how cultural travel could transform their employee development programs. I interviewed anthropologists, historians, and local guides from their international office locations. I created sample itineraries that would challenge their employees' assumptions while providing them with tools for cross-cultural communication. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing my navy blazer and the pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother, the same one she wore to her college graduation in 1987, when she walked across that stage as the first member of our family to earn a degree. The pearls had yellowed slightly with age, but they carried the weight of generational pride, the kind of pride that can't be bought or borrowed. As I looked in the mirror that morning, adjusting the necklace and smoothing my hair, I whispered the same prayer my mother taught me: Lord, let my words be heard and my presence be felt. Let me represent not just myself, but all the women who came before me and all the girls who will come after. I had no idea how prophetic those words would become, or how this journey would teach me that sometimes our presence is felt most powerfully not when we're welcomed, but when we're questioned. The drive to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport took 45 minutes through Atlanta's notorious traffic. I used the time to practice my presentation one more time, speaking aloud in my car, letting my voice find its natural rhythm without the self-consciousness that sometimes crept in during high-stakes situations. I had learned over the years that my accent became more pronounced when I was nervous or passionate, and I wanted to be prepared for both emotions during this meeting. As I pulled into the airport parking garage, I felt the familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that came with important business trips. But I also felt something else, a deep sense of gratitude for how far I'd come. 10 years earlier, I had been working as a marketing coordinator for a large hotel chain, watching other people build the kind of business I dreamed about. 8 years ago, I had taken the leap into entrepreneurship with nothing but savings and faith. Now, I was boarding a plane to potentially secure a contract that would establish Roots and Routes Travel as a major player in corporate cultural consulting. I whispered one more prayer as I gathered my bags and walked toward the terminal. Thank you for this opportunity. Help me to represent my company, my community, and myself with dignity and grace. I had no idea that my dignity would be tested before I even left the ground. The trouble started the moment I entered Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, a place I'd traveled through hundreds of times over the years. The terminal buzzed with its usual energy, business travelers hurrying toward gates, families managing crying children and overloaded luggage carts, announcements echoing in multiple languages overhead. It was controlled chaos, familiar and comforting in its predictability. I was running slightly late due to traffic, my presentation materials carefully organized in my carry-on bag alongside backup copies on 3 different flash drives and printed handouts in case technology failed me. As I approached the TSA checkpoint, I felt the familiar pre-travel nervousness mixed with excitement about the day ahead. The security line moved with typical airport efficiency, slow but steady. I found myself behind a businessman in an expensive suit who kept checking his Rolex and sighing dramatically at the pace. When I pulled out my phone to call Keisha, my assistant, to confirm last-minute details about the Seattle meeting, he turned around with an expression of barely concealed irritation. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he was used to being obeyed. "Could you keep it down? Some of us are trying to think." I looked around, confused. The airport buzzed with hundreds of conversations in dozens of languages. Mothers called after children who were running between luggage carousels. Business travelers barked into phones about missed connections and rescheduled meetings. Announcements echoed overhead in English and Spanish. Gate agents called for boarding groups over crackling intercoms. The ambient noise level was what you'd expect in any major airport. But somehow my voice, my southern accent discussing travel logistics with my assistant, was the one that demanded silence. "Of course," I said quietly, ending my call mid-sentence. "I'm sorry." But the damage was done. His comment had drawn attention from other passengers, and I felt the weight of curious stares. A few people had turned to look, trying to figure out what the disturbance was about. I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment, that familiar heat that comes when you're made to feel like you've done something wrong even though you know you haven't. The businessman turned back around with a satisfied nod, as if he'd performed some public service by policing my volume. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't really about volume at all. In my 8 years of business travel, I'd heard plenty of loud phone conversations in airports. I'd sat near crying babies, groups of college students laughing at videos on their phones, and businessmen practically shouting into their devices about quarterly earnings. None of them had been shushed. What was different about my conversation? The only variables I could identify were my appearance and my accent. And since I couldn't change my appearance, I found myself wondering, not for the first time, if the way I spoke was somehow marking me as someone else, as someone who didn't belong in professional spaces. When I reached the TSA checkpoint, I handed over my ID and boarding pass to the security officer, a middle-aged white woman with tired eyes, graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Her name tag read Janet, and she looked at my documents with what seemed like unusual scrutiny. "First class?" she asked, her eyebrows raised in a way that suggested surprise rather than simple confirmation. "Yes, ma'am." She studied my boarding pass again, then looked at my ID, then back at my face. The line behind me was growing longer, but she seemed in no hurry to wave me through. "And you're traveling for?" The question caught me off guard. In dozens of trips through airport security, I'd never been asked about the purpose of my travel by a TSA agent. Their job was to verify identity and check for security threats, not to interrogate passengers about their itineraries. "Business. I have a client meeting in Seattle." She studied my face again as if looking for signs of deception. "What kind of business?" The question hung in the air like humidity before a summer storm. I had been asked this question before, by potential clients, by networking contacts, by curious relatives at family reunions, but never by the TSA. Never with that particular tone that suggested my answer would be met with disbelief. "Travel consulting," I answered, keeping my voice steady despite the growing unease in my stomach. She called over her supervisor, a tall man with graying temples and the kind of military bearing that made other passengers instinctively step back. "Frank, can you come here for a minute?" Frank approached with measured steps, his eyes already assessing me before Janet had finished explaining whatever concern she had. I watched his expression change as I spoke, saw him register my accent and make immediate assumptions about my education, my profession, my right to be holding a first-class boarding pass. "Is there an issue with my identification?" I asked, proud that my voice remained steady even as my heart rate increased. "Where are you originally from?" Frank asked, ignoring my question entirely. The question hit me like a physical blow. Not, "Where do you live?" or, "Where are you traveling to?" but where was I originally from, as if my accent had marked me as perpetually foreign in my own country, as if I needed to prove my right to exist in this space. "Atlanta," I said firmly, drawing on the strength my grandmother had taught me to find in moments like this. "Born and raised. But your family? Where are they originally from?" I felt something shift inside me, a familiar anger that I'd learned to keep carefully controlled. "Also Atlanta, sir. My grandmother was born in rural Georgia in 1943. My great-grandmother was born in the same county in 1918. My family has been in Georgia for over a century." "Sir, is there a problem with my documentation?" Frank and Janet exchanged a look that I couldn't quite interpret, but I caught Janet whispering something about "doesn't seem right," while gesturing toward my boarding pass. The phrase made my stomach clench. What didn't seem right? My ID was valid. My boarding pass was legitimate. I had committed no crime, shown no suspicious behavior, done nothing but exist in this space while speaking with an accent that apparently raised red flags. "Ma'am, we're going to need to do an additional screening," Frank announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. I felt my cheeks burn with humiliation as curious eyes turned toward me. Other travelers began to whisper among themselves, probably wondering what I had done to warrant extra attention. In their minds I was sure there must be a reason. Security officers don't single people out for no cause. I must have done something, said something, been carrying something that justified this treatment. I was directed to a separate area, a small space with plastic chairs and fluorescent lighting that felt more like an interrogation room than a security checkpoint. My bags were searched with meticulous attention, every item examined and questioned. Janet pulled out my business cards as if they might be forgeries. "Routes and Routes Travel," she read aloud. "And you're the owner of this company?" "Yes, ma'am. I founded it 8 years ago." I watched doubt flicker across her face like shadows. A young black woman with a southern accent owning a travel company? Flying first class to meet with corporate clients? It didn't fit whatever narrative she had constructed in her mind about who belongs in what spaces. "What type of consulting do you do exactly?" she asked, rifling through my presentation materials with rough hands that showed no respect for the hours of careful preparation they represented. "I help companies create authentic cultural travel experiences for their employees," I explained, watching her handle my proposals as if they might contain state secrets rather than PowerPoint presentations about cross-cultural communication. Cultural experiences? Frank had returned, and the way he said culture made my stomach clench. As if culture itself was suspicious when it came from someone who looked like me, spoke like me. Like what kind of culture? All kinds. African, European, Asian, Latin American. We believe travel should be about connection and understanding, not just sightseeing. Janet was now examining my business cards under a magnifying glass, as if the paper itself might reveal some hidden deception. And you own this company? You're not just representing them? The implication was clear. Surely I couldn't actually own a business sophisticated enough to warrant first-class travel and corporate meetings. I must be someone's assistant, someone's representative, someone carrying papers for a more qualified person. I am the founder and CEO, I said firmly. I started this company in 2011 with a business loan and a dream to change how people experience travel. But I could see in their eyes that my words weren't landing. My accent, my appearance, my very presence in this space with these credentials didn't compute for them. In their worldview, people like me didn't own companies like mine. We're going to need to verify some information, Frank said. Please wait here. I sat in that plastic chair for 45 minutes, watching other passengers move through security with ease. I watched businessmen in expensive suits sail through without a single question about their destinations or their right to be there. I watched white women my age pass by without additional screening, without interrogation about their family origins or their business purposes. A young TSA officer, a black man who couldn't have been more than 25, kept glancing over at me with apologetic eyes. When Janet finally walked away to consult with another supervisor, he approached carefully. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about this," he said quietly, checking to make sure his colleagues weren't listening. Sometimes people see what they expect to see instead of what's actually there." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We both understood. In his words, I heard the echo of countless conversations I'd had with other black professionals about the extra scrutiny we faced, the additional hoops we had to jump through, the constant need to prove our right to occupy spaces that others took for granted. "It's all right, baby," I told him, using the same gentle tone my grandmother used when life showed its uglier face. "It's not your fault." But it wasn't all right. Nothing about this was all right. I was being treated like a criminal for the crime of traveling while black, for speaking with an accent that marked me as other in my own country. During those 45 minutes, I watched Janet make several phone calls, presumably trying to verify information that was already clearly documented in my valid identification. I watched her speak with 3 different supervisors, each of whom approached me with the same skeptical expression. I watched other passengers move through the line while I sat in bureaucratic limbo, my important meeting time ticking away. The most painful part wasn't the delay, it was the looks. The way other passengers stared at me with mixture of curiosity and judgment. The way children pointed until their parents shushed them. The way some people moved their bags a little further away from where I was sitting, as if whatever threat I supposedly represented might be contagious. I found myself doing something I hated, overcompensating. I pulled out my phone and made a show of checking my business emails, hoping people would see the corporate correspondence and understand that I belonged here. I straightened my blazer and touched my pearls, reminding myself of the generations of strength they represented. I spoke on the phone with Keisha about meeting logistics, carefully enunciating each word in the hopes that clearer diction might somehow legitimize my presence. But why should I have to prove anything? Why should my accent, my appearance, my very existence in this space require additional justification? When they finally cleared me, finding, of course, absolutely nothing wrong with my documentation, my business, or my right to travel, I had missed my original flight. The next flight to Seattle wouldn't leave for 3 hours, which meant I would arrive barely in time for my meeting, with no opportunity to review my materials or mentally prepare for the presentation that could change my company's future. As I gathered my scattered belongings, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and humiliation, Janet called out, "Have a nice trip, ma'am. And maybe, speak a little more clearly next time. People might understand you better." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and making my legs feel unsteady. Speak more clearly. As if my accent, my heritage, my very voice was something shameful that needed to be hidden, corrected, sanitized for public consumption. I wanted to turn around and say 100 things. I wanted to tell her about my master's degree in business administration from Emory University, about the awards my company had won for promoting cultural understanding through travel, about the clients who specifically sought us out because of our authentic approach to tourism. I wanted to tell her about my grandmother who cleaned white people's houses for 30 years but still managed to send my mother to college, About my mother who taught in underfunded schools but never let anyone tell her she wasn't smart enough or capable enough. I wanted to tell her that my voice carried the history of survival, of resilience, of people who found beauty and strength in their speech even when the world tried to silence them. Instead, I walked away. Because that's what we're taught to do, isn't it? Walk away. Don't make a scene. Don't give them more reasons to see you as a threat, as angry, as difficult. Keep your dignity intact by swallowing your pain. But with every step toward my gate, something inside me was changing. Something was shifting from hurt to anger to determination to something I couldn't quite name yet. It would take me hours to recognize it as power. The 3-hour delay gave me time to think, too much time. I sat in the airport restaurant, staring at my reflection in the window overlooking the tarmac, wondering what Janet had seen that made her so suspicious. Was it my skin? My hair, natural and professional but not straightened into submission? My accent, which carried the music of my heritage? Or was it simply the audacity of my presence in a space she felt I didn't belong? The restaurant was busy with delayed travelers, but I felt utterly alone. I ordered sweet tea out of habit, then immediately regretted it when the server looked surprised. Sweet tea in an airport restaurant probably seemed like another confirmation of my otherness, another marker that I didn't belong in the sophisticated world of business travel. I called Keisha to update her about the delay and found myself breaking down as I recounted what had happened. "They did what?" she exclaimed when I told her about the security incident. "Maya, that's not right. That's discrimination, plain and simple." "It's complicated, Keisha. They didn't say anything explicitly racist. They were just thorough." "Thorough my foot," she said, her voice rising with indignation. "When's the last time you saw them ask a white businessman where he was originally from? When's the last time you saw them search someone's business materials like they were looking for weapons?" She was right, of course. But what could I do? File a complaint that would disappear into some bureaucratic void? To the TSA? I had a business to run, a meeting to get to, a life to live. The system that had humiliated me was the same system I needed to navigate to succeed. I can't fight every battle, Keisha. I have to pick my fights. But this isn't just about you, Maya. This is about every black woman who travels for business. Every person with an accent who gets treated like they don't belong. If you don't say something, who will? Her words stayed with me as I tried to prepare for my meeting. I pulled out my laptop and attempted to review my presentation, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes I found myself replaying the security incident, thinking of all the things I should have said, all the ways I could have handled it differently. "Just focus on the Seattle presentation," I finally told Keisha. "I'll deal with this later." But I couldn't focus. As I sat there, I started noticing things I'd trained myself not to see over the years. The way the waitress took longer to come to my table than to others, even though I'd been seated first. The way she seemed surprised when I ordered confidently and tipped generously. The way conversations quieted when I spoke on the phone with clients, as if my voice required special attention, special scrutiny. I thought about all the times I'd modified my speech in professional settings, consciously flattening my vowels and dropping cultural references that might mark me as other. I thought about the code switching I did without even realizing it, the way I altered my entire presentation of self depending on the audience. When did I start doing that? When had I begun to see my own voice as something that needed to be managed, controlled, minimized for the comfort of others? I remembered my first job out of college working in marketing for a hotel chain. My supervisor, a well-meaning white woman named Linda, had pulled me aside after my first client presentation. "Maya, you're so smart and prepared," she had said, "but you might want to work on speaking a little more professionally." Professionally? I had asked, genuinely confused. Just neutrally. Some clients might not take you as seriously with such a strong regional accent. I was devastated. I thought I had been professional. I had prepared thoroughly, dressed appropriately, spoken confidently. But apparently my voice itself was unprofessional. That night, I had gone home and practiced speaking neutrally, in front of my mirror, trying to flatten the musical curves of my natural speech into something more acceptable. It felt like trying to sing without rhythm, like trying to dance without moving my hips. But I did it. Because I wanted to succeed. Because I wanted to prove that I belonged in professional spaces. Because I had internalized the message that my natural voice was somehow wrong. Now, sitting in this airport restaurant, I realized how much energy I had spent over the years trying to make myself smaller, more palatable, less threatening. How much of my authentic self I had hidden to make others comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Safe travels, baby girl. Remember who you are. Remember who you are." The words echoed in my mind as I finally boarded the plane and settled into my seat. The flight attendant, a kind-faced woman with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, smiled warmly as she offered me a beverage. "First time traveling for business?" she asked conversationally. "No, ma'am. I've been traveling for work for years." "What do you do?" When I told her about my travel company, her eyes lit up with genuine interest. "That sounds wonderful. I've been a flight attendant for 30 years and I've seen how travel can change people. Most folks just want to check places off a list, but you're talking about real connection. That's beautiful." We talked for a few minutes about cultural tourism, about the difference between being a tourist and being a traveler, about how authentic experiences could break down barriers and build understanding. She listened to my accent without judgment, without questions about my origins or my qualifications. She heard my ideas, not my drawl. "You know," she said before moving on to other passengers, "the world needs more people like you. People who understand that every culture has something beautiful to offer, and that real travel is about opening your heart, not just your camera." Her words were a balm to my wounded spirit, but they also crystallized something I'd been feeling all day. If the world needed more people like me, why was I spending so much energy trying to be less like myself? The flight to Seattle gave me time to think more deeply about what had happened and what it meant. I pulled out my journal, a habit I'd maintained since college, and began writing about the experience. As I wrote, patterns began to emerge that I hadn't seen clearly before. This wasn't the first time my accent had been policed. It wasn't the first time my presence in professional spaces had been questioned. It wasn't the first time I'd been made to feel like I needed to prove my right to be somewhere. But it was the first time I'd started to wonder why I was participating in my own diminishment. I wrote about Linda, my former supervisor, and how her helpful advice had led to years of self-censorship. I wrote about clients who had seemed surprised by my expertise, as if my accent had primed them to expect incompetence. I wrote about networking events where I'd felt like I was performing a version of myself rather than being myself. I wrote about my grandmother, who had never hidden her accent despite cleaning houses for white families who probably looked down on her speech. I wrote about my mother, who had taught inner-city children with pride and passion, never apologizing for where she came from or how she sounded. When had I become more concerned with fitting in than with standing out? When did I start seeing my heritage as a handicap rather than a strength? As the plane descended into Seattle, I made a decision. I wasn't going to apologize for my voice anymore. I wasn't going to code switch or modify my speech to make others comfortable. I was going to walk into that meeting as myself, fully, authentically, unapologetically myself. If Tech Forward wanted to work with Roots and Routes Travel, they would be working with Maya Johnson from Atlanta, Georgia, complete with the accent that told the story of where I came from and the strength that got me where I was going. The meeting in Seattle went well, better than well. The Tech Forward executives were impressed with our proposal, particularly our approach to creating meaningful cultural exchanges rather than superficial tourist experiences. But I could tell they were also surprised by me, by the depth of my knowledge, by the sophistication of our approach, by the disconnect between their assumptions and my reality. During the presentation, I caught myself starting to modify my speech several times, then consciously chose not to. I let my natural rhythm flow, let my accent color my words like spices in a well-prepared meal. I spoke about cultural immersion with the same voice I used at family dinners, with the same warmth I brought to conversations with my grandmother. And something amazing happened. Instead of seeming less professional, I seemed more authentic. Instead of losing credibility, I gained it. The executives leaned in when I spoke, engaged more deeply with my ideas, and asked more thoughtful questions. Sarah Martinez, Tech Forward's Director of Global Operations, pulled me aside after the presentation. "Maya, I have to tell you, your passion for this work is contagious. You don't just talk about cultural understanding, you embody it. Our employees need that kind of authenticity." But something had shifted inside me during that long day of travel. The meeting's success felt hollow somehow, overshadowed by the humiliation I'd experienced just getting there. As I sat in the Seattle airport waiting for my return flight, I found myself unable to shake the feeling that succeeding despite discrimination wasn't the same as addressing discrimination. On the flight back to Atlanta, I found myself seated next to Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a linguistics professor at University of Washington who was heading to a conference at Emory University. She was reading a book about the evolution of American English, and we struck up a conversation about language, identity, and belonging. "You have a beautiful accent," she said after listening to me talk about my business. "Very musical. Southern?" "Yes, Georgia born and raised. Though I'll admit I sometimes try to tone it down in professional settings." Dr. Rodriguez looked genuinely puzzled. Why would you do that? The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught me off guard. Why would I do that? What was I afraid of? What was I trying to prove? I suppose people take me more seriously when I sound more neutral. Neutral. She repeated the word like it left a bad taste in her mouth. Do you know what neutral really means in American English? It means white, middle class, Midwestern. It means erasing the beautiful complexity of regional speech patterns, the history embedded in every accent, the cultural richness that makes our language alive. She pulled out her phone and showed me pictures from a research project she'd been working on, recordings of speakers from across the country, mapping the beautiful diversity of American English from Boston Brahmin to Texas drawl, from New York rapid fire to California laid back, from Minnesota nice to Louisiana spice. Your accent tells the story of the Great Migration, she continued, her voice growing passionate. It carries African linguistic patterns that survived slavery and evolved into something uniquely American. It holds the music of spirituals, the rhythm of poetry, the resilience of people who maintain their humanity in the face of dehumanization. It's a living piece of history, and you want to tone it down? Her words hit me like lightning, illuminating things I'd never thought about before. I had never considered my accent as carrying history, as being part of a larger story of survival and creativity and resistance. I've spent my career studying language, she continued, and I can tell you that linguistic discrimination is one of the most insidious forms of bias because it masquerades as preference. People say they want clear communication, when what they really mean is, speak like me. They say they want professionalism, when what they really mean is, don't remind me that there are other ways of being in the world. She told me about her research on accent bias in hiring, about studies showing that people with non-standard accents were less likely to be hired, promoted, or taken seriously in professional settings. She told me about the psychological toll of constant code switching, about the way linguistic discrimination reinforced other forms of bias. But here's what's really tragic, she said. When we silence diverse voices, we don't just hurt individuals, we impoverish our entire culture. We lose the creativity, the innovation, the different ways of seeing and thinking that come from linguistic diversity. By the time we landed in Atlanta, Dr. Rodriguez had given me her card and invited me to speak at a conference on linguistic diversity and cultural tourism. But more importantly, she had given me a new lens through which to see myself and my experience. As I walked through Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, the same airport where I'd been humiliated just 12 hours earlier, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to tell my story. Not as a complaint or a legal case, but as a story about the power of authentic voice, about the beauty of linguistic diversity, about the strength that comes from refusing to make yourself smaller for other people's comfort. I was going to turn my humiliation into education, my pain into purpose. I started writing that night, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and my laptop, the words flowing like water that had been dammed up too long. I wrote about the TSA incident, about the years of code switching, about the shame I'd carried for the way I spoke. But I also wrote about the beauty of Southern speech, about the history and resilience embedded in every inflection, about the music that made my voice uniquely mine. I wrote about my grandmother's stories, told in a voice that carried the wisdom of generations. I wrote about my mother's classroom, where she taught children to be proud of where they came from while reaching for where they wanted to go. I wrote about my own journey from shame to acceptance to pride. I shared the story on my company's blog, thinking maybe a few dozen people would read it. I titled it, The Music of My Voice, a Love Letter to Southern English. Within 48 hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Comments poured in from people around the world. Immigrants who'd been told their accents were unprofessional, Black Americans who'd faced similar linguistic discrimination, language teachers who used the post in their classes to discuss bias and authenticity. A woman from Boston wrote, I've been hiding my Boston accent for 20 years in corporate America. Your post reminded me that my voice tells a story too. A man from Jamaica shared, they told me to speak properly at work. But this is how I speak properly. This is my voice. A linguistics professor from California wrote, thank you for articulating what I've been trying to teach my students for years, that there's no such thing as standard English, only the dialect that people in power happen to speak. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the post went viral, I received a call that made my hands shake as I answered the phone. Ms. Johnson? This is Janet Williams from TSA at Hartsfield-Jackson. I read your blog post. I was silent for a long moment, unsure what to say. I wanted to call and apologize. I didn't realize. I never thought about how my questions might have sounded. I was just doing my job, but reading your story made me understand that the way I was doing my job was wrong. Her voice was shaky, uncertain, vulnerable in a way that surprised me. I've been a TSA officer for 12 years and I thought I was being thorough, professional. But you're right, I wouldn't have asked those questions to someone who sounded like my daughter. I wouldn't have doubted their documentation or their right to be there. I appreciate you calling, I said, and I meant it. The courage it must have taken to make this call, to admit fault, to be vulnerable with someone you'd wronged, that took strength. I've been thinking about what you wrote about linguistic bias, about how we police people's voices without even realizing it. I started paying attention to my own reactions and I realized, I do it all the time. I make assumptions based on how people sound, where they seem to be from, whether they fit my idea of what a first-class passenger should look like. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. Janet told me about her own background, growing up in rural Alabama, how she'd worked to lose her accent when she moved to Atlanta for work, how she'd internalized the idea that certain ways of speaking were more professional, more acceptable than others. I think I was hardest on people who reminded me of where I came from, she admitted. That doesn't excuse it, but maybe it explains it. I was so afraid of being judged for my own background that I became the judge. By the end of our conversation, Janet had asked if she could share my blog post with her colleagues, if I might be willing to speak to TSA officers about linguistic bias and cultural sensitivity. She wanted to be part of changing a system that had caused harm. I can't undo what I did to you, she said. But maybe I can help make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. The speaking engagement at the TSA training led to others. I found myself invited to conferences, corporate training, universities, and diversity workshops. My travel business evolved to include diversity and inclusion consulting, helping organizations understand how linguistic bias affects their employees and customers. The irony wasn't lost on me. The accent that had once been a source of shame had become my greatest professional asset. But more than that, it had become my mission. I spoke at Fortune 500 companies about creating inclusive environments for employees with diverse speech patterns. I consulted with airlines about training staff to recognize and combat accent bias. I worked with universities to help international students feel confident speaking in their natural voices rather than trying to sound American. But the real change was personal. I stopped code switching entirely. I stopped apologizing for the music in my voice. When clients called and heard my southern drawl, I didn't rush to prove my competence. I let my work speak for itself, knowing that my voice was part of what made that work authentic and powerful. 6 months after the TSA incident, I was invited to speak at the International Conference on Cultural Tourism in Barcelona. As I stood on that stage, addressing an audience of travel professionals from around the world, I thought about my grandmother, my mother, all the women who had passed down the gift of resilience along with the melody of Southern speech. Good afternoon, I began, my voice carrying across the auditorium with all its natural rhythm and warmth. My name is Maya Johnson, and I'm here to talk about the power of authentic voices in cultural tourism. I didn't speak more clearly. I didn't flatten my vowels or hide my heritage. I spoke with the full music of my voice and the audience leaned in to listen. After my presentation, a woman from South Africa approached me. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "I've been trying to sound more international in my work, but you've reminded me that my voice is part of what makes me valuable to my clients." A man from Scotland nodded. "I've been hiding my accent in business settings for years. After hearing you speak, I realize I've been hiding myself." The tech-forward contract, which had seemed so important that day in March, became just one of many opportunities that flowed from my decision to speak authentically about my experiences. More importantly, it became a catalyst for a larger conversation about inclusion, authenticity, and the power of diverse voices in business. A year after my blog post went viral, I received an invitation that brought everything full circle. The TSA wanted me to develop a training program on cultural sensitivity and unconscious bias for their officers nationwide. Janet, who had become an advocate for change within her department, would be helping to implement the program. "You changed how I see my job," she told me when we met to plan the training. "You helped me understand that security isn't just about checking IDs and scanning bags. It's about treating every traveler with dignity and respect, regardless of how they sound or where they come from." The training program launched in major airports across the country, reaching thousands of TSA officers. But more than the program itself, it represented something profound. The possibility that painful experiences could be transformed into positive change, that individual voices could spark systemic transformation. They tried to silence the music in my voice, telling me it didn't belong in professional spaces, that it marked me as less educated, less capable, less worthy of first-class treatment and corporate respect. They wanted me to speak clearly, as if my natural voice was somehow unclear, unprofessional, inappropriate for the world of business and travel. But they were wrong, about my voice, about my worth, about the power of authenticity in a world that too often demands conformity. Your voice carries your story, your heritage, your truth. Every accent tells a tale of geography and history, of family and community, of survival and strength. Don't let anyone convince you to turn down the volume on who you are, to flatten the beautiful complexity of your natural speech, to make yourself smaller for other people's comfort. The world doesn't need more neutral voices. It needs your voice with all its beautiful complexity and cultural richness. It needs the stories embedded in your speech patterns, the history carried in your vowels, the music that makes your voice uniquely yours. I learned that dignity isn't about changing yourself to fit other people's expectations. It's about standing in your truth so firmly that the world has no choice but to adjust its vision of what belongs, what sounds professional, what deserves respect. The TSA officer who questioned my right to be there eventually became an advocate for change within her department. The blog post that started as a personal story became a catalyst for conversations about linguistic bias in professional settings across the country. The accent I once tried to hide became the foundation for a career in helping others embrace their authentic selves. Sometimes the very thing that makes others uncomfortable about you is exactly what the world needs to hear. Sometimes your difference is your greatest strength, your authenticity your most powerful tool, your voice your most important contribution. Today when I walk through airports, I speak with the full melody of my Southern voice. When I present to corporate clients, I don't apologize for where my words come from or what stories they carry. When I train TSA officers on cultural sensitivity, I do it with the same accent that once made them suspicious, because now they understand that accent bias is their problem to solve, not mine to hide. Because I've learned that respect isn't something you earn by diminishing yourself. It's something you command by being unapologetically, authentically you. It's something you create by refusing to participate in your own silencing, by insisting on your right to exist in all spaces with your full voice, your complete self, your uncompromised truth. The music of my voice tells the story of survival, of resilience, of generations who refused to be silenced even when the world told them their words didn't matter. It's a song of struggle and strength, of heritage and hope, of women who passed down their voices along with their wisdom. It's a song worth singing at full volume, and I'm done apologizing for the beauty of its sound. Remember, your voice matters. Your story matters. You matter, exactly as you are, with whatever accent colors your words and whatever history shapes your speech. Don't let anyone convince you to sing softer, to speak more clearly, to hide the music that makes you who you are. The world is listening and it needs to hear your song. All of it. Every note, every rhythm, every beautiful variation that makes your voice yours. Because when we silence diverse voices, we don't just hurt individuals, we impoverish our entire culture. We lose the innovation that comes from different ways of thinking, the creativity that flows from varied perspectives, the beauty that emerges when all voices are allowed to sing their truth. Stand tall. Speak proudly. Let your voice carry the full weight of your heritage and the full power of your dreams. The world needs what you have to offer, exactly as you are, in exactly the voice that is yours.